I'm Deborah, 26 female. I live in a small but functional apartment in the city, a place I earned through years of freelance coding and ramen noodle-fueled nights. My life has been a carefully constructed tower of ambition, built on the dream of launching my own tech company, a social organizing app I call ConnectSphere. For the past 2 years, every spare dollar and every waking moment has gone into this project, a venture I believed I was building from the ground up, all by myself. I thought my biggest struggle was securing funding, but I was about to find out that my biggest struggle was sitting right across the dinner table from me, smiling as if they had my best interests at heart. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The restaurant was the kind my parents loved and I merely tolerated. It was all dark wood, hushed whispers, and menus that didn't list prices, a place where the cost of a single entree could cover my grocery bill for a month. This was their choice for my 26th birthday dinner, a celebration that felt more like a performance for their benefit than a genuine party for mine. My mother, Helen, was in her element, her meticulously styled silver blonde hair catching the light as she laughed a little too loudly at one of my father's tired jokes. My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair with an air of practiced ownership, the manager of a luxury car dealership who always seemed to be selling something, even if it was just an image of himself. The guest of honor and the only reason I'd agreed to come was my grandfather, Samuel. At 80 years old, he was a force of nature. A real estate tycoon who had built his empire from nothing, he carried an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He didn't need to be loud or flashy. His presence filled the room. Unlike my parents, who wore their aspirations like a costume, my grandfather wore his success with the comfortable ease of a well-worn coat. He was sharp, perceptive, and the one person in my family I felt truly saw me. The evening had progressed predictably. My parents talked about their recent trip to a wine region, a new listing my mother was eyeing purely for its social potential, and a particularly lucrative month at my father's dealership. I nodded and smiled, offering minimal input. They'd asked about my little computer project with a dismissive air, the way one might ask about a child's lemonade stand. I'd given them the usual update. That development was progressing, that I was working on the business plan, and that the biggest hurdle, as always, was securing startup capital. "It's a tough market, Deb," my father said, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. "These venture capitalists, they're sharks. You need a solid, proven concept before they'll even look at you." "And a good address doesn't hurt," my mother added, patting my hand. "Presentation is everything." I bit back the urge to tell them that the quality of the code and the viability of the business model mattered more than the zip code of my office, which was currently my spare bedroom. I knew it was useless. They lived in a world of surfaces, of appearances. My world was one of code, logic, and meticulous planning, languages they didn't speak. Grandpa Samuel had been mostly quiet, observing the conversation with his piercing blue eyes. He'd listen, take a slow sip of his water, and offer a small, non-committal hum. He never interrupted, but you could always feel him processing every word, filing it away. Finally, as the waiter cleared our main course plates, he leaned forward, placing his folded hands on the table. The subtle shift in his posture commanded immediate attention. My parents stopped talking. He looked directly at me, his gaze cutting through all the dinner party pretense. A warm, genuine smile touched his lips. "Deborah," he began, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "I'm so proud of the drive you have. Building something from scratch takes grit. Your grandmother would have admired that." I felt a genuine warmth spread through my chest. "Thanks, Grandpa, I'm trying." He nodded, his smile widening slightly. Then he leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone, as if sharing a secret just between us. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of his next words. "So," he said, his eyes twinkling, "how's the company doing with the startup capital I sent you?" The question hung in the air, thick and incomprehensible. I stared at him, my mind struggling to parse the sentence. The startup capital he sent me. It was like he'd suddenly started speaking another language. My brain cycled through every possible meaning. Was it a test? A hypothetical question? A joke I wasn't in on? I tried to form a response, but my mouth felt dry, my tongue thick. I managed a small, confused shake of my head. My voice, when it finally came out, was barely a whisper. What startup capital? The twinkle in my grandfather's eyes faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He tilted his head, studying my face. He saw no hint of a joke, no sign of misunderstanding, only genuine bewilderment. He'd expected excitement, a progress report, maybe even a thank you. He had not expected this. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. My parents were unnaturally still, their silverware frozen halfway to their mouths. Grandpa Samuel's gaze held mine for a moment longer before he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward my parents. The movement was measured, almost cinematic. It was the turn of a man who senses something is deeply wrong and is preparing to confront it. My father had a deer-in-the-headlights look on his face, his fork clattering softly against his plate. My mother's painted-on smile was frozen, a brittle mask of feigned composure. They looked like statues, caught in a moment of sheer panic. My grandfather's smile was now completely gone. His face, once warm and grandfatherly, had hardened into the impassive, unreadable expression of the CEO who had closed $100 million deals and crushed his competitors. The warmth in the air had evaporated, replaced by an icy chill. His voice was dangerously quiet, yet it cut through the restaurant's ambient hum like a razor. He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on my parents. Then who took it? The silence that followed my grandfather's question was not empty. It was dense, suffocating, and filled with everything that wasn't being said. My father, Richard, who could talk his way out of any corner on the sales floor, looked utterly trapped. His face, usually ruddy with confidence, had turned a pale, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. He seemed to shrink in his chair. The expensive suit that usually made him look powerful now, appearing like a costume on a man, playing a role he had forgotten. My mother, Helen, reacted differently. Where my father crumbled, she hardened. Her frozen smile tightened at the edges, her posture becoming ramrod straight. It was the defensive stance of a woman whose entire life was built on maintaining a flawless facade, and that facade was now under direct threat. She shot a venomous, panicked glare at my father, a silent command to do something, say something, fix this. But he had nothing. I felt like an observer to a scene that didn't involve me, yet I was at its very center. My grandfather's words echoed in my head, "The startup capital I sent you." It was a statement of fact. He sent money, for me, for my company. A wave of dizziness washed over me as the implications began to crash down. For 2 years, I had been scraping by, working side jobs, selling old possessions, and living on a shoestring budget. I had poured my heart and soul into ConnectSphere, believing my biggest challenge was my lack of resources. The stress had been immense, a constant weight on my shoulders. There were nights I'd stared at my ceiling, wondering if I had what it took to make it, if I should just give up and get a stable corporate job like my parents had always wanted. And all that time, there was money, capital sent specifically for me. My grandfather didn't need them to answer. Their reactions were the answer. His gaze, cold and analytical, shifted from my father to my mother and back again. He was no longer the doting grandfather. He was the businessman who had smelled a lie, a breach of trust. "Richard," Samuel said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Helen, I am going to ask one more time. 6 months ago, after Deborah pitched her app idea to me over the phone, I instructed my bank to wire $250,000 into an account for her. The transfer was confirmed. The money left my account." He paused, letting the number hang in the air like a guillotine. $250,000. I think I stopped breathing. That amount of money wasn't just startup capital, it was a life-changing sum. It would have accelerated my project by years. It would have meant hiring a team, proper marketing, a real office. It would have meant everything. The bank statements show it was deposited into a joint savings account, my grandfather continued, his eyes narrowing. An account under the names Richard and Helen. An account I was told was a trust for Deborah, to be managed by you until she had a formal business entity established. My father finally found his voice, but it was weak and reedy. Samuel, there's been a misunderstanding. Is there? My grandfather countered, his voice lethally soft. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks quite simple. I sent my granddaughter $250,000 to start her business, and she never received it. Yet, in the last 6 months, you've purchased a new luxury sedan. He nodded at my fath. And you've put a down payment on a summer home in the Hamptons. He turned his gaze to my mother. And you've undergone what appears to be some very expensive home renovations. Tell me, Richard, how does a dealership manager afford such a lifestyle? Were sales really that good? My mother's composure finally cracked. This is a private family matter, she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. You have no right to interrogate us like this in public. This stopped being a private matter the moment you stole from your own daughter, Samuel shot back, his voice rising just enough to make the couple at the next table glance over. He didn't care. The performance was over. You didn't just take my money, you took her future. You let her struggle day after day while you were living on her dream. The accusation hit me with the force of a physical blow. You let her struggle. All those times I'd called them, stressed about rent, and they'd offered empty platitudes like, well, that's the life of an entrepreneur, or maybe it's time to consider a more stable career path. They weren't just being unsupportive, they were actively deceiving me. They were watching me barely tread water while they sunbathed on a yacht bought with my life raft. The anger came then, hot and blinding. It burned away the confusion and the shock, leaving behind a cold, hard rage. I looked at my parents, these two people who were supposed to be my biggest champions, my ultimate safety net, and I saw strangers. Thieves. Their lives, their fancy car, their Hampton house, their perfect social image, it was all funded by my stolen future. My father started stammering, trying to piece together a coherent lie. We were holding it for her, for safekeeping. The market is volatile. We thought it was best to invest it first, to make it grow before giving it to her. It was a financial strategy. It was the weakest, most pathetic excuse I had ever heard. He was a financial advisor, or at least, that's what he used to be before the dealership. He knew how flimsy that sounded. My grandfather let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of any humor. A financial strategy? Richard, you couldn't strategize your way out of a paper bag. You invested it, all right, in yourselves. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. The sound was final, like a gavel striking down a verdict. He stood up, towering over the table, a patriarch whose trust had been irrevocably broken. The meal is over, he announced, his voice booming in the quiet restaurant. He threw a black credit card onto the table. Pay for it with this. It may be the last thing you ever get from me. He then turned to me, his expression softening instantly. The anger vanished, replaced by a deep, profound sadness and regret. Deborah, he said gently, come with me. We are leaving. I didn't hesitate. I stood up, my legs shaking but steady. I didn't look at my parents. I couldn't. If I looked at them, I didn't know what I would say or do. As I walked past their table, following my grandfather out of the restaurant, I could feel their eyes on my back, burning with shame, fear, and desperation. The silence they left behind was filled with the sound of their perfect world shattering into a million pieces. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a war. The ride back to my grandfather's penthouse was silent. I sat in the plush leather passenger seat of his car, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. The rage that had ignited in the restaurant had settled into a cold, heavy lump in my stomach. My mind was a chaotic storm of betrayal and questions. How could they do this? Why? For 2 years, I had meticulously documented every line of code, every market analysis, every late-night brainstorming session for ConnectSphere. It was more than a project. It was my entire identity. and they had treated it, and by extension me, as nothing more than an ATM. When we arrived, Samuel led me into his study. It was a room that smelled of old books and leather, a sanctuary of quiet power. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, handing one to me. "Drink this," he said gently. "It will help." I took a sip. The liquid burned a welcome trail down my throat, steadying my nerves. He didn't press me to talk. He simply sat in his high-backed leather chair opposite me, waiting. He understood that the first step was processing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. "They've always been like this," I finally whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I just never saw it." It was true. My entire life, my parents' love had felt conditional, transactional. It was tied to my achievements, but only the achievements they understood and approved of. Good grades, acceptance into a prestigious university, a summer internship at a well-known firm, these were things they could boast about at dinner parties. My decision to become an entrepreneur, to forego a safe corporate ladder for the uncertainty of a startup, was a source of quiet shame for them. It wasn't prestigious. It didn't come with a fancy title or a guaranteed salary. It was messy, unpredictable, and, in their eyes, a step down. "They care more about the appearance of success than success itself," Samuel said, his voice laced with a weary disappointment. "Your father has always been desperate to keep up with a lifestyle he can't afford. Your mother is obsessed with social standing. They saw a shortcut, and they took it, without a single thought for who they were stepping on to get it." He was right. Their lives were a carefully curated illusion. The luxury car was leased. The country club membership was paid for with credit cards. The designer clothes were bought on sale. They were drowning in debt, and my stolen future was their lifeline. The $250,000 wasn't an investment in their portfolio. It was a plug for the gaping holes in their sinking ship. "What did they do with the money, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice gaining a harder edge. "The car and the house, that can't be all of it." He sighed, leaning forward to open a drawer in his large oak desk. He pulled out a thin file folder and slid it across the polished surface toward me. "I started looking into it this afternoon, before the dinner. I had a bad feeling. I called you a week ago to ask for an update, and you mentioned you were still struggling with funding. Something didn't add up, so I had my financial analyst pull some public records." My hand trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were documents that laid out my parents' financial ruin in stark, black-and-white detail. There were credit card statements with staggering balances, letters from collection agencies, and a notice of lien against their house. They were in far deeper trouble than I could have ever imagined. The car, the renovations, the down payment on the Hampton house, it was all a desperate, foolish attempt to maintain the facade while their world crumbled. But there was more. The last page in the folder was a bank statement from the joint account, the one my grandfather had wired the money into, the one that was supposed to be my trust. The initial deposit of $250,000 was there, dated 6 months ago. What followed was a sickening series of withdrawals. Large sums were transferred to my father's personal checking account. Tens of thousands paid directly to credit card companies. A transfer of $50,000 to a real estate agency, likely the down payment on the vacation home. They had bled the account dry in less than half a year. The current balance was less than $500. Seeing it all laid out, the sheer brazenness of their theft was nauseating. They hadn't just borrowed the money. They had systematically dismantled my dream to fund their lie. "There's something else you should know, Deborah," my grandfather said, his expression grim. "The story your father told about investing it, it's a lie, of course, but there's a kernel of truth. He did make an investment." He explained that his analyst had found a record of a $75,000 wire transfer from my father's account to a high-risk, speculative tech stock, a penny stock, essentially. A gamble. The kind of move a desperate amateur makes, hoping for a miracle. "The stock crashed," Samuel said flatly. 3 months ago, he lost every penny." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. It was the perfect, tragicomic cherry on top of this disaster. Not only did they steal from me, but they had also been colossally stupid with a portion of the money, gambling away my future on a long shot. My father, the man who had patronizingly warned me about shark venture capitalists, had been the biggest fool of all. The web of deceit was more tangled and pathetic than I could have imagined. This wasn't a calculated move by criminal masterminds. It was a panicked, greedy, and utterly selfish act by two people terrified of their own mediocrity. They weren't just thieves, they were failures, and they had tried to use me to cover it up. "What do we do?" I asked, looking up from the damning documents. The shock was finally wearing off, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I was not going to be a victim in their pathetic story. My grandfather looked at me, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of the old twinkle return to his eye. It wasn't warmth this time, it was something sharper, more dangerous. "They took your money, and they lied to my face," he said, his voice a low growl. "They broke the 2 cardinal rules in my book. We don't get mad, Deborah." He leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "We get everything." The plan began to form in that moment, in the quiet of his study. It wasn't just about getting the money back. It was about dismantling the lie they had built their entire lives around. It was about justice. And I knew I would. LD-n't be doing it alone. My first call would be to my best friend, Ben. If my parents had been playing in a world of financial lies, I was about to introduce them to a world of digital truth. And Ben was the gatekeeper. The next morning, I met Ben at a small, nondescript coffee shop far from my parents' usual haunts. Ben and I had been friends since college, where we'd bonded in a late-night coding class. While I had pursued app development, he had delved into the world of cybersecurity. He was brilliant, discreet, and fiercely loyal. If my grandfather was my general, Ben was about to become my head of intelligence. I laid everything out for him: the dinner, the missing $250,000, the folder of documents, and the pathetic story of my parents' financial implosion. He listened intently, his expression shifting from sympathy to a focused, analytical anger on my behalf. Ben had met my parents on several occasions and had always found their brand of polished condescension grating. "So, let me get this straight," he said after I finished, stirring his black coffee with methodical precision. "They stole your startup fund, used it to prop up their failing lifestyle, and gambled away a chunk of it on a bad stock tip." "That's the short version, yes," I replied, sipping my own coffee. My hands were still not entirely steady. "Wow," he breathed out. "That's not just betrayal, Deb, that's a special level of scum." He leaned forward, his demeanor changing. The friend was gone, replaced by the cybersecurity analyst. "What do you need?" "Grandpa and I have a plan," I explained, "but we need proof. Hard, undeniable proof that ties every single dollar of that stolen money to their personal expenses and poor decisions. We have the bank statements showing the withdrawals, but we need to connect the dots. We need to show why they needed the money so badly. We need to find every email, every text, every online purchase that proves they did this with malice and forethought." Ben's eyes lit up with a familiar glint of professional excitement. This wasn't just a favor for a friend, it was a challenge. "You're talking about a full digital forensic analysis. It's not exactly legal without their consent, Deb." "I know," I said, meeting his gaze. "But they live on a shared family cloud account that I set up for them years ago. Photos, documents, backups. They use it for everything. I still have administrative access. It's a gray area, but legally, I have the right to be in there." A slow grin spread across Ben's face. "A gray area? I can work with a gray area." That afternoon, we set up a command center in my small apartment. Ben brought over a laptop with a partitioned, untraceable operating system and a set of encrypted hard drives. We ordered pizza, and for the next 48 hours, fueled by caffeine and a shared sense of righteous purpose, we dove into the digital life of Richard and Helen. It was uglier than I could have ever imagined. The family cloud was a treasure trove of their deceit. Ben, with his expertise, was able to access backups of their text messages, email archives, and even their browser histories. It was like peeling back the layers of a rotten onion. First, we found the emails between them from 6 months ago, right after my grandfather had called to tell them about the money. "Samuel is giving Dee the money," my father had written. "It's going into the joint account we set up. This is the answer to our prayers." My mother's reply was even more damning. "Thank goodness. I can finally call the contractor back about the kitchen. And Richard, book the down payment for the Hamptons place before it gets snapped up. We deserve this. She's young, she can start over if her little project fails." She can start over. The callousness of it stole my breath. They didn't see it as my one shot, they saw it as a disposable resource, a temporary solution to their own self-inflicted problems. My dream was just collateral damage. We kept digging. We found the online receipts for my mother's extravagant shopping sprees, designer handbags, expensive shoes, art for their newly renovated living room. We cross-referenced the dates and amounts with the withdrawals from the trust account. It was a perfect match. We found my father's browser history. It was a pathetic chronicle of a man in a panic. Searches for how to get rich quick, best penny stocks 2024, and frantic visits to stock market forums where he was clearly taking advice from anonymous trolls. We found the digital receipt for his $75,000 stock purchase, and a few months later, desperate searches like how to recover from massive stock loss and declare bankruptcy without losing your house. Ben even managed to recover deleted text messages. There were furious exchanges between my parents as the money began to run out. "The account is almost empty," my father had texted. "The stock was a bust. We're in deeper trouble than before." "This is your fault, Richard," my mother had replied. "You and your stupid get-rich-quick schemes. What are we going to tell Samuel when he asks Deborah about the company?" "We'll figure something out, we always do. Just tell her to get a real job." That last text hit me the hardest. Just tell her to get a real job. All those conversations where they'd subtly undermined my confidence, suggesting my project was a hobby and that it was time to be realistic. It wasn't concern for my well-being. It was part of the cover-up. They needed me to fail, or at least to give up, so the question of the missing money would never come up. Ben compiled everything into a meticulously organized, encrypted file. Every piece of evidence was time-stamped and cross-referenced with the financial records my grandfather had provided. He created a clear timeline of the theft, from the initial deposit to the final, pathetic dregs of the account. It was a digital tapestry of greed, incompetence, and breathtaking selfishness. "This is airtight, Deb," Ben said, leaning back from his keyboard as the final file finished encrypting. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "This isn't just proof, this is a confession." I looked at the file icon on the screen. It represented the complete and utter destruction of any lingering filial duty I might have felt. My parents hadn't just made a mistake. They had orchestrated a long-term, calculated campaign of theft and deception against their own child. I copied the file onto a secure USB drive. The next step was to present this to my grandfather. His plan had been contingent on having irrefutable evidence. Now we had it. The time for quiet investigation was over. It was time to build the weapon that would bring their entire world crashing down, and my grandfather knew exactly how to do it. With the USB drive containing my parents' digital confession clutched in my hand, I went back to my grandfather's penthouse. I found him in his study, reviewing a stack of legal documents. The air in the room was thick with purpose. I plugged the drive into his laptop, and together we went through the evidence Ben had compiled. We saw the texts, the emails, the browser history, the online receipts. My grandfather's face remained impassive, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. Each new piece of evidence was another nail in my parents' coffin. When we finished, he was silent for a long time. He simply stared at the screen, at the cold, hard proof of his son's betrayal. "I helped Richard start his first business," he said quietly, his voice raspy with emotion. "It was a small dealership. I gave him a loan, advice, my contacts. He ran it into the ground within 5 years. He always blamed the market, the economy, everyone but himself. I see now that he never learned a thing. He finally looked away from the screen, his eyes meeting mine. The sadness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. They chose their path, now they will walk it to the end. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. It wasn't about suing them or calling the police. A public legal battle would be messy, protracted, and, in his words, undignified. He believed that true justice wasn't about punishment from the outside, but about forcing people to face the consequences of their own actions. His weapon of choice was not a lawsuit, but his last will and testament. My will is a fairly straightforward document, he explained, tapping a thick binder on his desk. It divides my estate, the real estate empire, the investments, the properties, equally among my children, your father and his 2 sisters. But, he paused, a grim smile playing on his lips, there is a specific morality clause. It's something my lawyers insisted on years ago. It states that any beneficiary found to have committed an act of gross financial misconduct or moral turpitude against another family member can be disinherited by a majority vote of the estate's board of executors. My eyes widened. Who is on the board? Myself as chairman, he said. My lawyer, my financial advisor, and my 3 children, your father and your aunts, Margaret and Elizabeth. I saw the trap immediately. But my aunts, they'd never vote against their own brother. Under normal circumstances, you'd be right, my grandfather agreed. Family loyalty is strong. However, that loyalty is predicated on trust. Your aunts are good women. They are successful, responsible, and they despise dishonesty. They believe your father is a bumbling but harmless salesman. They have no idea about the true state of his finances or the depth of his desperation. We are about to show them. The plan was to call an emergency board meeting. The pretense would be a review of the annual estate performance. My father would walk in expecting a boring afternoon of charts and figures. My mother, who wasn't on the board, would be invited to attend as well, under the guise of a family. Dinner afterwards, my grandfather wanted her there to witness the fallout. But the disinheritance clause, it just cuts him out of the will, right? I asked. That doesn't get my money back. Patience, Deborah, he chuckled. That's just the appetizer. The main course is what comes next. He explained the second part of his plan. Once my father was confronted with the evidence in front of his sisters, he would be given a choice. Option A, the board would vote to enact the morality clause. He would be publicly disinherited, cut off completely. His sisters would be informed of the full extent of his theft and financial ruin. The shame would be absolute. He would lose not only his future inheritance, a sum in the tens of millions, but also the respect and relationship of his entire family. Option B, he could avoid the disinheritance vote by agreeing to a set of terms. First, he would sign a legally binding document, drafted by my grandfather's lawyer, confessing to the theft of the $250,000 and agreeing to a repayment plan. The plan would be brutal. Their house, the one they had just renovated with my money, would be sold immediately. The new car would be returned. The down payment on the Hamptons property would be forfeited. All proceeds from the sale of their assets would be used to repay me, with interest. They will be left with nothing, my grandfather said, his voice cold as ice. They will have to start over, from scratch, with no help from me or anyone else in this family. They will be forced to live the life of struggle they so callously inflicted upon you. But there was a final, brilliant twist. The repayment document, he continued, will also contain a clause. Your father will sign over his future inheritance, all of it to you, as collateral against the debt. If he ever misses a single payment, the collateral is forfeit, and his share of the estate becomes yours permanently. He will spend the rest of his life paying back the money he stole, and the price of his freedom from public disgrace will be the very fortune he was counting on. It was a masterstroke. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about poetic justice. They stole my future to fund their present. Now, they would have to sacrifice their own future to pay for their past. They would be trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. The vast wealth they had been anticipating their entire lives would be dangled just out of reach, a constant reminder of what they had lost. "It's perfect," I breathed, a sense of awe mixing with the cold fury in my heart. "They will choose option B," my grandfather said with absolute certainty. "Your father is a coward, and your mother is a socialite. The only thing they fear more than being poor is being seen as poor and shameful by their peers and family. They will do anything to avoid that public humiliation." He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Jonathan," he said, his voice all business, "I need you to draft a confession and repayment agreement and schedule an emergency board meeting for this Friday. It's time to restructure the family's future." The day of the board meeting arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. My grandfather had booked the main conference room at his corporate headquarters, a sterile, intimidating space on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city. The long, polished mahogany table felt like a judge's bench. My role was simple: to be present, a silent, visible reminder of the crime. I sat next to my grandfather at the head of the table. I was dressed not as a victim, but as the CEO of my own company. A sharp, professional blazer, my hair pulled back, my expression neutral. My aunts, Margaret and Elizabeth, arrived first. Margaret was a no-nonsense surgeon, and Elizabeth was a successful university professor. They were intelligent, grounded women who had little patience for my father's bluster. They greeted me warmly, though they looked slightly confused by my presence at what was supposed to be a closed meeting. Then my parents walked in. My father, Richard, was in his element, wearing his best suit, ready to play the part of the savvy businessman. He faltered slightly when he saw me, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but he quickly covered it with a bluff smile. "Deborah, what a surprise, taking an interest in the family business." My mother, Helen, looked around the room with a critical eye, as if assessing its decor. She was dressed to the nines, a walking advertisement for the life they had stolen to maintain. She gave me a tight, artificial smile. "So lovely you could join us, dear." They had no idea. They were lambs walking into a slaughterhouse, still commenting on the quality of the fixtures. Once everyone was seated, my grandfather began. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "I've called this emergency meeting to address a matter of grave importance regarding the estate and the integrity of this family. We have a situation that falls under the purview of the morality clause of my will." The mood in the room shifted instantly. My aunts exchanged a look of alarm. My father's smile froze on his face. He glanced nervously at my grandfather, then at me. "As you know," my grandfather continued, "the clause allows for the disinheritance of any beneficiary found guilty of gross financial misconduct against another family member. Today, we will be discussing such a case." He paused, letting the tension build. Then he looked directly at my father. "Richard." My father paled. "Dad, what is this about?" Instead of answering, my grandfather nodded to me. I stood up, walked to the head of the table, and connected my laptop to the large monitor on the wall. The first image that appeared was a copy of the bank transfer confirmation: $250,000 from Samuel's account to the joint account of Richard and Helen, designated for Deborah's tech startup. 6 months ago, my grandfather announced to the room, I gifted Deborah $250,000 to fund her company. She never received it. The money was deposited into an account controlled by Richard and Helen, who then proceeded to systematically drain it for their own personal use. A collective gasp came from my aunts. My father shot to his feet. This is an outrage. It's a misunderstanding. We were investing the money for her. Sit down, Richard, my grandfather commanded, his voice like a whip crack. My father, shocked by the tone, sank back into his chair. For the next 20 minutes, I walked the board through the evidence. I didn't editorialize or show emotion. I presented the facts with the cold, detached precision of a prosecutor. I showed them the emails where my parents celebrated their windfall. the text messages where they planned how to spend it, the credit card statements that lined up perfectly with the withdrawals, the receipts for the luxury car, the home renovations, the Hamptons down payment. Finally, I put up the evidence of my father's disastrous $75,000 gamble on the penny stock. The room was utterly silent, save for my voice narrating the methodical destruction of my parents' credibility. My mother stared at the screen, her face a mask of horror as her private messages and purchases were laid bare. My father was visibly sweating, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. My aunts looked at their brother with expressions of dawning disgust and profound disappointment. When I finished, I sat down. The digital breadcrumbs had formed an unbreakable chain, leading directly from my grandfather's generosity to my parents' greed. My grandfather let the silence hang for a moment before speaking. The evidence is, as you can see, irrefutable. Richard, Helen, you have stolen from your own daughter. You have betrayed my trust and disgraced this family. Aunt Margaret was the first to speak, her voice trembling with rage. Richard, how could you? We all knew you had money problems, but this is monstrous. To steal from your own child. We were going to pay her back, my father pleaded, his voice cracking. It was just a loan. A loan you never asked for and never intended to repay. Elizabeth countered, her face flushed with anger. You let her struggle while you lived off her future. It's despicable. My mother finally broke. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Her perfect facade had crumbled, leaving behind the pathetic, desperate woman she truly was. My grandfather held up a hand, silencing the room. The damage is done. Now we discuss the consequences. He slid 2 documents across the table toward my father. You have 2 options. Option A, we hold a vote. I can assure you it will be unanimous. You will be disinherited publicly. Every member of this family and anyone else who matters will know exactly what you did. He let that sink in. Or there is option B, he tapped the second document. You sign this confession and repayment agreement. You will sell your assets, the house, the cars, everything of value, to repay Deborah the $250,000 with compounded interest. Furthermore, you will sign over your entire future inheritance as collateral against this debt. You will live under the weight of this arrangement for the rest of your lives. But your sisters will agree to keep this matter private. You will be spared public humiliation. My father stared at the documents, his hands shaking. He looked from the disinheritance notice to the confession. He looked at his sisters' disgusted faces. He looked at my mother's tear-streaked, ruined makeup. He saw his entire social world, the one his wife valued above all else, threatening to evaporate. As my grandfather had predicted, it wasn't a choice at all. For a man like my father and a woman like my mother, shame was a fate worse than poverty. We'll sign, he whispered, his voice hoarse with defeat. He picked up the pen. His hand, which had so easily signed away my future, now trembled as he signed away his own. My mother followed suit, her signature a messy scrawl through her tears. They had chosen their cage. The meeting was over. Judgment had been rendered. The aftermath of that day was swift and brutal. My grandfather's lawyers descended upon my parents' lives with ruthless efficiency. A for sale sign went up in front of their meticulously renovated house within a week. The luxury car was repossessed. The forfeiture of their Hamptons deposit was finalized. They were forced to liquidate any assets they had of value, my mother's jewelry, my father's collection of expensive watches. Piece by piece, the empire they had built on my stolen money was dismantled. They moved into a small, cramped rental apartment in a less desirable part of town. My father had to take a second job, working evenings at a different dealership, to make ends meet. My mother, who hadn't held a job in 30 years, had to find work as a receptionist at a dental office. The humiliation was their constant companion. Their friends, noticing the sudden and dramatic downturn in their lifestyle, began to whisper. My parents offered vague excuses about bad investments and downsizing, but the story never quite held up. The social circle they had sacrificed everything for slowly and quietly abandoned them. True to their word, my aunts kept the secret, but their relationship with my father was permanently fractured. Family gatherings became tense, awkward affairs. They were civil, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a permanent air of disappointment. My parents were pariahs in their own family, forced to wear a mask of normalcy while knowing everyone at the table knew the ugly truth. A week after the board meeting, $285,000 was wired into my newly established business account, the original $250,000 plus interest. Staring at the balance on my computer screen felt surreal. It wasn't just money, it was vindication. It was the key to the future I had almost lost. With the capital secured, I was finally able to execute the plans I had spent 2 years dreaming of. I hired Ben as my CTO, offering him a generous salary and a stake in the company. We leased a small but modern office space downtown and brought on a talented team of developers and designers. ConnectSphere, the project that had existed only on my laptop and in my mind, roared to life. The work was intense, but it was joyous. Every long night and every difficult coding problem was a victory. My grandfather acted as my mentor, providing invaluable advice on business strategy, networking, and leadership. He never once mentioned the situation with my parents again. For him, the matter was closed. Justice had been served, and the only thing that mattered now was the future. 6 months later, we launched the beta version of ConnectSphere. The response was incredible. Users loved the intuitive interface and the innovative features. Tech blogs started writing about us. We were the classic underdog story, a young, bootstrapped founder who had created something fresh and exciting. No one knew just how true that bootstrapped part almost was. As for my relationship with my parents, it ceased to exist. They tried to reach out a few times, sending guilt-laden texts and leaving tearful voicemails. They spoke of making a mistake and wanting their daughter back. But I never responded. Their apologies felt as hollow as their promises. They weren't sorry for what they did, they were sorry they got caught. They hadn't mourned my pain, only the loss of their comfortable life. Forgiveness was a currency they hadn't earned. 1 year after that fateful birthday dinner, ConnectSphere secured its first round of venture capital funding, a valuation that placed the company's worth in the millions. I stood in our bustling office, surrounded by my brilliant team, and looked out the window at the city. I had built this. Not my parents, not their stolen money, but me. My resilience, my hard work, my refusal to give up. The theft had been meant to crush my dream, but instead, it had forged me into someone stronger. I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the people who are supposed to build you up are the ones who will try to tear you down, but they had failed. I had taken their betrayal and used it as fuel. They had tried to bury my future, not knowing it was a seed. And from the ashes of their deceit, my success had risen, brighter and more powerful than I had ever dared to imagine. I had a new beginning, one that was entirely my own.